He still checks the mailbox every morning. 50 years later, he knows what it is. A reflex. The war ended, but the silence never did. It never ends when you leave the best of you in a place you can't remember. They used to say the quiet was the worst part. But they were wrong. The worst part was the sound of nothing. The utter lack of her laughter when he closed his eyes. He remembered the docks of New York, 1943. He was Private Elias Thorne. Just another grunt with a cheap duffel bag and a promise that felt too big for his 20 years. His girl, Sarah, had pressed a crumpled photograph into his palm, her against a summer sky squinting into the sun. It smelled like gardenias and home. "Don't you dare die for a postcard, Elias," she'd whispered, her voice rough. He'd laughed. A stupid, nervous laugh. "I'm coming back for the cabin." 2 stories, blue paint, and enough room for a library. Elias never forgot that cabin. It was the only map he carried. It was the place he'd return to when the sounds of the mess hall, the shouts of his sergeant, the constant metallic clink of his dog tags, all became too much. He tapped the picture in his breast pocket, a silent reminder that the war was a detour, not a destination. But once the boat hit the freezing grey churn of the English Channel, the map started to fade. The smell of gardenias was replaced by the sour tang of wet wool and fear. He learned the rhythm of a rifle before he learned the cadence of a foreign tongue. He was a soldier now, a number, a piece of shrapnel aiming for the heart of Europe. He remembered the last letter he wrote her before hitting the beaches. He hadn't told her where he was, only that the sky was bigger than he remembered and that he missed her making coffee in the mornings. He signed it, always until the end of the line. He should have kept the pen in his hand longer. The morning sun was already high when she finally awoke, and the sounds of the city had given way to the songs of country birds. She reached across the bed, finding only the cold, crumpled sheet. His absence was an echo of the night before, a silent reminder of the decision that had hung in the air between them, as heavy and final as the door he had closed behind him. They landed in Normandy, near Omaha Beach, on the 4th wave. Not the movies, no flags or slow-motion heroism. Just a brutal, cold, tidal rush of boys hitting the sand, turning red before they could stand up. The water was a churning, icy grave, and the ramp went down into a geometry of death he couldn't comprehend. Elias's training meant nothing. It was raw survival, a blind animal scramble. He crawled past faces frozen in a final moment of shock, boys from Ohio and Kansas who would never see a harvest again. The roar of the German MG-42s, that terrible ripping sound they called Hitler's buzzsaw, made a joke of his eardrums and his courage. For 3 days they were pinned on that strip of hell. The world shrank to the few feet of sand in front of his face. He learned to taste the iron of blood in the air, to distinguish the whine of an incoming mortar from the flat crack of an 88mm shell. The difference was academic. It usually just meant life or immediate pink oblivion. He saw a man from his platoon try to stand, to rally, his mouth open in a scream Elias couldn't hear. A sniper's round took him in the throat, and he sat down hard, as if he'd simply decided to rest, a look of profound surprise on his young face. When they finally pushed off the beach, it was into the famous hedgerows of the French countryside, the bocage. The postcards lied. They weren't picturesque scenery. They were death traps, a labyrinth of ancient earthen walls so thick a tank could hide behind them. Every shadow hid a rifle. Every rustle of leaves was a potential ambush. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming honeysuckle, a sickeningly sweet perfume that tried to mask the stench of cordite and death. He was just a rifleman, a grunt, part of a squad pushing inland toward the village of Saint-Lô, a town they were told was a key crossroads. A town that would soon be erased from the earth by the very bombs meant to save it. The reality of the war was the mud that clung to his boots like a greedy living thing. It was the constant low-grade stench of unwashed bodies and fear. It was the unending fatigue that felt heavier than his pack. And it was the grim, desperate humor that was the only thing keeping them sane. They gave each other nicknames based on how they'd die. Shrapnel Harris, Dysentery O'Malley. Elias was lucky. No one said it was a good kind of luck. One night, after a day of crawling through orchards under sporadic artillery fire, they hunkered down in a tiny, shallow foxhole that stank of earth and sweat and the previous occupant's fear. The rain started again. a cold, insistent drizzle that found its way through every layer of wool and canvas. His buddy, Sergeant Miller, a lanky kid from Georgia who'd been a school teacher, nudged him with a trembling hand, offering a crumpled, damp cigarette. "You still got that picture, Thorne?" Miller's voice was thin, worn down to a whisper by the day's terror. Elias didn't speak. His throat was closed with a dust that no amount of water could wash away. He just patted the left breast pocket of his jacket over his heart. The photograph was there, a soft square of paper that was somehow both a comfort and a wound. "Hold on to it," Miller whispered, the cigarette bobbing between his lips. "That's the only truth left out here. Everything else." He gestured vaguely at the dark, menacing shapes of the hedgerows. "Everything else is just dust waiting to happen." Elias nodded, the motion feeling stiff and unnatural. He thought of Sarah's face, the way she squinted in the sun. He tried to summon the smell of gardenias, but all he got was wet wool and damp earth. He tried to hear her laugh, but all he heard was the distant hollow thump of artillery and the relentless patter of the rain on his helmet. He didn't know it then, couldn't have known, but Miller would be gone by morning. A single stray sniper round from a hedgerow 200 yards away. A silent, efficient casualty. No last words, no dramatic gesture. Just a sudden stillness in the foxhole next to his when the dawn light finally broke through the grey. When they shook Miller awake for watch and found him cold, Elias closed his eyes. He pressed his forehead against the cool, muddy wall of the hole. He searched for Sarah's face in the darkness behind his eyelids, desperate for that map, that promise of a different world. But for the first time in months, he couldn't see her. All he could see was the silhouette of the endless rain and the ghost of a smile on a dead schoolteacher from Georgia. The map had faded. He was lost. The letters from Sarah were his oxygen. They arrived in crumpled envelopes, smelling faintly of the world he was supposed to be fighting for. Not the grand ideals, but the small things. The scent of her perfume, a ghost of gardenia on the paper, the smudge of what might have been coffee. She wrote about her job at the factory, the metallic scent of machinery replacing the sweet smell of the bakery where they'd met. She wrote about the other girls, their faces pinched with a shared, silent dread as they waited for their own men. She wrote about the radio playing Glenn Miller in the parlor, the big band swing feeling like a desperate, cheerful lie against the backdrop of a world holding its breath. He'd read them by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp in the mess hall. The words a temporary shield against the greasy smell of boiled potatoes and the low grumble of the other men. He'd traced the loops of her handwriting with a grimy finger, a connection to a reality that felt more like a dream with each passing day. Those letters were his tether, the only proof that the mud, the fear, and the constant grinding exhaustion were not the entirety of existence. Then came the one with the stamp from a place called Paris. It was late August 1944. The news had crackled over the radio, tinny and triumphant. Paris was free. His unit, however, was pushing hard into Belgium, the celebration a distant rumor. They were preparing for what the grim-faced officers called a final German counterattack. They were exhausted, unshaven, their uniforms stiff with dirt, living on the metallic taste of K rations and a thin, sharp adrenaline that was starting to sour. The letter felt different, lighter, too light. He tore it open with a thumb, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The air left his lungs in a quiet rush. It wasn't Sarah's flowing script. It was a block print, neat, almost clinical. The language was formal, apologetic, a stark contrast to the intimate chaos of her words. It was from a man named Jean-Pierre, a doctor in a field hospital. "Your fiancée, Miss Sarah Williams, insisted I write this." Elias's eyes scanned the lines, not reading so much as absorbing the blows. She arrived with the Red Cross just after the liberation. She has been very helpful to the wounded. The pause in the text felt like a chasm. But last night, near the main railway station, there was a sudden skirmish. "A stray bullet, Mr. Thorne. It was quick. She asked me to send you this postcard. I apologize for the delay in the message. She was very brave." He reread the final line 5 times. The ink began to blur, the words dissolving into meaningless black marks. She was very brave. What did that mean? What did that change? His fingers, numb and clumsy, found the postcard tucked inside. It was garishly bright, a joke in a world of grey. The Eiffel Tower, a cartoonish red against an impossible blue sky. He turned it over, and there it was. Her handwriting, the elegant familiar curve of the letters he knew better than his own. A single word, written months ago, filled with a hope that now felt like a physical poison. Soon. The sound that escaped him wasn't a sob. It was the quiet, internal collapse of a structure he didn't know was still standing. He was aware of the other men moving around him, the clatter of gear, the low murmur of conversation. He was aware of the damp Belgian earth beneath his boots, but it was all happening on the other side of a thick, soundproof glass. A nearby artillery barrage suddenly lit up the twilight, the concussion wave hitting them seconds later. The ground shuddered. Men ducked instinctively. The sky flashed orange and white, illuminating the skeletal trees. Elias Thorne didn't move. He just stood there, a statue in the mud, holding the thin, flimsy papers that had just dismantled his universe. The world had gone completely, irrevocably dark. The oxygen had been cut off, and the only thing left was the silence. A roaring, absolute silence that was louder than any gun. He didn't cry, not then. Crying was a luxury for the living. It required a belief in a future where tears had meaning. He had none. He just stood there in the mud, the thin paper clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. The noise of the guns, the screams of the wounded, the distant hum of Allied planes, all of it became a buzzing static, meaningless. The war was a radio broadcast from a country that had just ceased to exist. He was no longer a citizen. He dropped his rifle. The M1 Garand, his constant companion, the cold weight that had become an extension of his own tired arms, fell into the thick European soil with a sickening, final thud. It was a sound more profound than any explosion. It was the sound of surrender, not to the Germans, but to the absolute gutting truth. He had written her name on his ammo clips, a superstitious habit, a silent prayer. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. He had told himself every bullet fired was one step closer to home, to her. Now home was a lie, and the bullets were just metal. The prayer had been returned unanswered. He should have kept fighting. He should have yelled, cursed God, torn the postcard to pieces. But he felt nothing, only a profound, physical lightness, a terrifying buoyancy, as if the single thing anchoring him to the earth had been severed. He was adrift in a silent, airless sea. Sergeant McIntyre, a hard-bitten man from Texas with eyes the color of the winter sky, saw it. He didn't ask questions. In that war, men broke in different ways. Some screamed, some got quiet, some just let go. He saw the rifle in the mud, the vacant stare, the paper in Elias's hand that was clearly not a standard-issue map. He'd seen it before. Thorne! McIntyre's voice was a low growl, cutting through the static in Elias's head. He moved in close, his body a shield against the curious glances of the other grunts. Pick it up, now. That's your only friend left. Elias looked at the rifle, then at the postcard. The Eiffel Tower, a stupid bright red slash against a fake blue sky. And that word, soon. It wasn't a promise anymore. It was a taunt. A epitaph. He finally bent down, his movement slow and deliberate, like a man moving underwater. His hand hovered inches from the cold, oily steel of the Garand. His fingers, caked in dirt and dried rations, brushed against the stock. Then they moved past it. He picked up the postcard instead. The paper felt flimsy, insignificant, a feather that had collapsed his entire world. He left the rifle lying there. He turned and walked away from the foxhole, away from his squad, toward the vague direction of the mess hall. He walked with no urgency, no fear. He didn't duck at the whine of an incoming shell that landed 100 yards away, showering the trees with shrapnel. He didn't flinch. He was a shell already, hollowed out, moving on momentum alone. If a stray piece of shrapnel found him now, it would just be meeting its echo. McIntyre watched him go, his jaw tight. He didn't call after him again. He just bent down, picked up the discarded rifle and slung it over his own shoulder. It was a soldier's mercy, an unspoken understanding. The boy who was there a minute ago was gone. What remained was a ghost in a uniform, crossing a line that wasn't on any military map. It was a terrifying, silent line drawn in the mud of a Belgian field. He didn't know it then, but he had crossed a line that wasn't on any military map. A terrifying, silent line drawn in the mud of a Belgian field that separated fighting for a world from fighting the memory of one. The mess hall was a cacophony of forced normalcy. The clatter of tin plates, the rough, tired laughter of men trying to forget, the smell of weak coffee and stew that all tasted of tin and despair. Elias moved through it like a sleepwalker. He found an empty crate in a corner, away from the lantern light, and sat. He placed the postcard on his knee, face down. He couldn't look at the word. Soon. A kid from Ohio, barely 18, sat down next to him, talking a mile a minute about a French girl he'd met, her smile, how he was gonna write to her. Elias didn't hear the words. He just watched the boy's mouth move, saw the desperate, hopeful light in his eyes. It was a light he recognized. It was the light he'd carried in his own breast pocket next to the photograph. Now it was extinguished. He felt a surge of something that wasn't quite anger, but a deep, weary pity. He wanted to tell the kid to stop, to build no futures here, to hold on to nothing. But he said nothing. He just stared at the grimy wood of the table, tracing the grain with a dirty finger. He became aware of a single persistent sound cutting through the din of the mess tent. A drip, a steady plink, plink, plink of water falling from the canvas roof into a small puddle by his boot. It was the most maddening, precise sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of time passing. It was the sound of a world continuing to turn indifferently without her in it. He stood up abruptly, the crate scraping against the hard ground. The conversation around him stuttered for a second, then resumed. He walked back out into the damp, cold air. The night was clear now, the stars sharp and cold and impossibly distant. He looked up at them. They were the same stars she would have seen, the same stars that had watched her fall. They offered no comfort. They were just holes punched in the fabric of nothing. He had crossed the line. And on this side there was only the quiet. The roaring, absolute quiet that was louder than any gun. The quiet where her laughter used to be. Sergeant McIntyre caught up with him, not with a shout, but with a weary hand on his shoulder. "She's gone, isn't she, Thorne?" Elias just nodded, his throat a closed fist. Words were a luxury he could no longer afford. "Well, Thorne, everyone here has a ghost. You just met yours a little early." McIntyre paused, his eyes scanning the empty, darkening landscape, a man reading a map of sorrows. "You're off the line. Headquarters needs a runner. You got legs. Go deliver this to Major I. Davenport's in the command post. Now move." It was a silent order to survive, a soldier's mercy, a way to keep a man from putting his own rifle in his mouth. Elias became a runner, a ghost delivering messages through the relentless rain and artillery fire that painted the sky a constant bruised orange. He moved between decimated villages and temporary command posts, carrying reports, maps, and sometimes the terrible, folded-up news of a unit wiped out. He ran, not to get anywhere, but to feel the sting of the cold and the raw burn in his lungs. Anything to feel real. Anything to outrun the image of a single word written in elegant script. Soon. The running took him further east, into the skeletal trees and frozen mud of the Ardennes forest. The air grew teeth. The snow fell in heavy, silent sheets, muffling the world, making every footstep a secret. The fear was no longer a sharp spike of adrenaline. It was a dull, constant ache in the marrow, a companion as familiar as his own shadow. This was where the Germans were massing, the intelligence reports whispered. This was the quiet before the storm of the Battle of the Bulge. He didn't read Sarah's other letters. He couldn't. They sat in his breast pocket, a silent, unread monument, a weight that was both physical and spiritual. He could feel the shape of the envelope against his heart, a second scarred layer of skin. He remembered her voice on the docks a lifetime ago. "Don't you dare die for a postcard, Elias." The irony was a shard of glass in his gut. She had died for a city, for a radio, for a truth he was only just beginning to grasp. And he felt the suffocating guilt of every soldier who keeps breathing when a better, brighter soul is silenced. He was a thief of air. One evening, his boots crunching on the frozen crust of the snow, he saw a young private from his old squad. The boy was maybe 19, his face still soft with a life not yet lived. He was holding a letter, tracing the handwriting with a grimy, reverent finger. He saw Elias and grinned, a flash of white in the grimy twilight. "From my girl, Sarge," the boy said, his voice too loud, too hopeful. "Says she's planting an apple tree, for when I get back." Elias looked at the boy. He saw the desperate, fragile light in his eyes. It was the same light he'd carried in his own breast pocket, right next to the photograph. A light that believed in apple trees and futures. Now his own light was extinguished, and all he felt was a deep, weary pity. He wanted to grab the boy by his jacket and shake him. "Stop, don't build it. Don't plant a single seed. It's all just kindling for the fire." But he said nothing. His own voice was buried too deep. He just gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod and kept running. He ran until his legs were numb and his breath came in ragged, crystallized clouds. He ran until the only sound was the blood pounding in his ears, a rhythm that almost, but not quite, drowned out the memory of her laugh. He ran until he collapsed into a frozen ditch, his body screaming, his mind finally blessedly empty. He lay there staring up at the hard, bright stars. They were the same stars she would have seen. The same stars that had watched her fall. They offered no comfort. They were just holes punched in the fabric of nothing. A reminder of the infinite, indifferent cold. The greatest lie the war told him was that running could be an escape. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed, but no matter how far or fast he went, the ghost kept pace, a silent companion in his desperate flight. December 1944, the siege of Bastogne. The weather was a white horror. The skies choked with snow and fog, grounding the Allied air support. Elias was trapped with the surrounded 101st Airborne, shivering in frozen foxholes, listening to the German shells fall like grim Christmas carols. The cold was a physical presence, a fifth enemy that chewed through wool and leather, gnawing at the bones of men who were already just ghosts of themselves. His job was simple: run the perimeter with messages scrawled on damp paper, run for water that was mostly ice, run to the makeshift aid station where the morphine was gone and the screams were a language everyone understood. He ran to keep the blood moving, to feel the burn in his lungs, a sensation that proved he was still tethered to a body, to a life. The running was a prayer, a curse, a pointless race against the encroaching stillness. One afternoon the shelling paused, not out of mercy but for the Germans to regroup. In that eerie, manufactured quiet, his boots crunched through the shattered stained glass of a small church. The roof was mostly gone, open to the bruised grey sky. And there, amidst the splintered pews and fallen stone, stood a piano. A polished black upright, absurdly intact, like a punchline from a god who'd forgotten the joke. A fine dusting of snow lay across its closed lid. He didn't think. His body moved for him. He sat on the frozen bench, the wood biting through his trousers. He opened the lid. The keys were chipped, yellowed. He blew on his stiff, clumsy fingers, the warmth of his breath a fleeting ghost. Then he played, not well. He fumbled, his knuckles aching with the cold. But the notes came out, a simple, hopeful melody that Sarah used to hum while shelling peas on her mother's porch. A tune from a world before the world ended. One by one they came. A handful of paratroopers, their faces gaunt and shadowed, drawn by the sound like moths to a dying flame. They didn't speak. They just stood in the ruins, their breath pluming in the air, their eyes fixed on nothing, on everything. They listened to the broken, tinny notes that tried to summon a world they were sure they'd never see again. A world of front porch swings and Sunday drives. A world where a melody was just a melody and not a weapon against the silence. Elias played until his fingers were numb, and the cold had seeped into the very heart of the music, slowing its rhythm to a funeral dirge. He saw their faces, these hard men, their defenses down for 3 minutes and 17 seconds. He saw the boy who believed in an apple tree, and in that moment he felt a sudden, sharp clarity, as clean and cold as the air in his lungs. Sarah didn't die to make him a monument of grief. She hadn't been erased by a random, meaningless bullet. She had died fighting, just like the men around him. She had died for the idea of a future, for the people in this cold, starving town, for the right to sit at a piano without fear. She died believing in the music even if she couldn't hear it anymore. His fingers stilled on the keys. The final note hung in the air, then was swallowed whole. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than the German guns. It was a weight you could feel in your teeth. He looked at his hands, then at the faces of the men. One of them, a lanky kid from Ohio named Corrigan, gave him a single slow nod. It wasn't thanks. It was an acknowledgement. A shared secret. For a few moments, they had all been somewhere else. Elias stood, the bench scraping against the stone floor. The spell was broken. The distant thump of artillery started up again, a reminder of their real grim carol. But something had shifted inside him, a fundamental recalibration of his soul. The map was gone, the cabin was ash, but the compass still pointed true. A new understanding settled over him, a quiet conviction that to honor her sacrifice meant living, not just surviving. Even if that future felt like a betrayal of everything they'd planned. He walked out of the ruined church back into the snow. The cold didn't feel quite as deep. The run back to the command post felt different. His legs were still tired, his body still ached, but he wasn't running from something anymore. He was running for it, for the melody, for the ghost of a girl who hummed on a porch, and for the faint, stubborn echo of that tune in the heart of a dying world. The siege broke. The sun finally appeared, a weak, pale eye in a sky that had been bruised for weeks. It was a different kind of assault. The light was brutal in its honesty, exposing the frozen, mud-churned horror of the landscape in stark relief. The sky filled with the beautiful, terrible sound of P-47 Thunderbolts, their engines a roaring hymn as they dropped supplies and a shred of hope. The Germans retreated, melting back into the skeletal trees of the Ardennes. Elias, exhausted and hollowed out, was just a body moving through the thawing mud. The melody from the ruined church was still a faint echo in his chest. A tuning fork struck against the silence, but his limbs were heavy with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. He was reassigned. No more running messages. They gave him to an army photographer, a man named Frankie, whose face was as lined and weathered as an old map. Frankie was a cynic who had seen too much through a lens, and he carried his camera like it was both a shield and a confession. He didn't talk much, but he understood the quiet. His language was one of instructions and the rapid, percussive clicks of his camera shutter. It was a sound that replaced the mortars, a different kind of violence. "Over here, Thorne. Look at the light," Frankie would grunt, his voice a low rasp. "That's the only truth that matters out here. The light and what it falls on." And Elias looked. He saw the light fall on the splintered ribs of a barn, on the rusted husk of a panzer, on the face of a dead soldier whose eyes were still open to the sky. Frankie's camera captured it all, freezing the chaos into a single damning frame. They moved through the wreckage of a dozen nameless Belgian villages, places that had existed only on maps and were now just geography for ghosts. They entered a devastated farmhouse on the outskirts of Bastogne. The roof was mostly gone, and the floor was a treacherous carpet of shattered porcelain, splintered wood, and the personal debris of a life interrupted. A child's wooden horse, a woman's hairbrush, the smell of damp plaster and old smoke. Elias's boot kicked something and he bent down. It was a small silver-framed photograph. The glass was webbed with cracks, but the image beneath was perfectly intact. A young European couple on their wedding day. He was in a stiff, ill-fitting suit, she in a simple dress, both of them smiling with a simple, fierce joy that seemed to radiate from the paper. They looked exactly like he and Sarah had looked. It was their same hope, their same unshakable faith in a future they believed they were entitled to. Frankie saw him looking, his camera momentarily still. He lit a cigarette, the smoke a gray ghost in the cold air. "The war doesn't care about love, kid," he said, his tone flat, final. "It just burns the evidence." But Elias knew, with a sudden, quiet certainty, that Frankie was wrong. The love wasn't the evidence the war was destroying. The love was the evidence. It was the proof of what they were fighting for. That photograph, that smile, that was the reason the smoke had to clear. It was the blueprint for the two stories, blue paint and a library, that the surviving world would have to build from these ashes. The war wasn't the story. The lives it interrupted were. He didn't pocket the photograph. That would have been a theft. Instead, he gently, carefully placed it face down on a relatively intact shelf, protecting the smile from the indifferent light, from the falling snow, from any more harm. It was a small, futile gesture, a sacrament. Frankie just grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, and moved on, his camera already seeking its next truth. They spent days like that, a silent pair haunting the edges of the advance. Elias drove the jeep, hauled Frankie's equipment, and learned to see the world through the photographer's dispassionate eye. He saw the light fall on a group of haggard German prisoners, their faces not monstrous, just young and terrified. He saw it fall on a Belgian woman handing a flower to a grimy American paratrooper, a moment of stunning grace that Frankie's shutter captured in a heartbeat. He was beginning to see the war not as a reason to stop living, but as a reason to start seeing the humanity, the fragments, the tiny, unbreakable things that persisted in the midst of the colossal breaking. One evening, parked near a command post, Frankie was cleaning his lenses. He spoke without looking up. "You lost someone. Back in the States?" Elias stared at the horizon, where the last of the light was bleeding out. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "Not in the States?" Frankie nodded slowly, as if that was the only answer he'd expected. He held up a camera lens, peering through it at the dying sky. "The light's gone for today." He looked at Elias, his cynical eyes holding a flicker of something else. "Understanding, perhaps. We're pushing into Germany tomorrow. The light's different over there, colder." Elias just nodded. He was beginning to understand that the war was a series of doors, and he was being led through each one. Further away from the boy he had been, closer to the man he would have to become, the man who carried the evidence. The relentless push continued into Germany. The landscape was grim, the final resistance fierce. Elias was no longer a runner, but a driver, ferrying grim-faced officers and wooden crates of supplies in a jeep that smelled of gasoline and damp earth. The front line was a shifting, nebulous thing, but the trauma was a constant, a low hum in the blood, like the distant artillery that never quite stopped. One afternoon, they stopped near a shattered bridge over the Rhine. The skeletal ironwork clawed at a grey, unforgiving sky. The engineers were already at work, their shouts thin and lost in the wind. Frankie was off somewhere, chasing his light, leaving Elias alone with the engine's ticking silence. It was time. His hands were not steady as he pulled the packet from his inner pocket. The bundle of letters from Sarah, tied with a faded ribbon, felt heavier than his sidearm. He'd carried them through the mud of Normandy, the frozen hell of Bastogne, treating them like a holy relic, too sacred, too terrifying to open. Now, sitting in the back of the jeep, the cold wind whipping the paper, he broke the seal. The first few were full of her, full of life. Her flowing script described her training with the Red Cross, her excitement at going overseas, her quiet, unspoken fear. She wrote about the other girls, about the smell of iodine and hope, about listening to the BBC and imagining she could hear his breath in the static. They were letters from a world that still made sense. But in the final three, dated just weeks before her arrival in Paris, the tone shifted. The script grew tighter, more deliberate. "Elias, my love," one began. "I'm not just going to wrap bandages. There is so much work here beneath the surface. Jean-Pierre is part of something bigger, something quiet. The whispers we hear, they need to become shouts. If I can help, really help, I have to." The next letter was more direct, the words a stark confession that made his breath catch. She wasn't in a field hospital. She was running a small, illegal radio operation from a back room near the Gare de l'Est, relaying messages for the resistance, hiding under the flimsy guise of the Red Cross. The man, Jean-Pierre, was not a simple doctor. He was a key organizer, an architect of silent strikes and stolen information. The last letter was only 2 sentences, rushed and smeared, as if written in a hurry or in the dark. It was the final message, the one she knew might be her last. "The Germans are everywhere. The nets are closing. If you hear nothing from me, know that I chose this. I chose to fight with the truth, my love." The wind tore at the page, and Elias gripped it harder, his knuckles bone white. The pieces, the terrible, magnificent pieces, clicked into place with the finality of a rifle bolt. The block-printed note from Jean-Pierre, the stray bullet, the skirmish. It was all a shield, a beautiful, necessary lie. Sarah hadn't been an accidental casualty. She had been doing dangerous, vital work. She had been caught. And Jean-Pierre, to protect her memory, to protect the entire cell, had created the accident story. A Red Cross nurse killed in crossfire was a tragedy. A spy was a message, a warning, a reason for reprisals. He looked up from the paper, his eyes dry and burning. The Rhine flowed below, choked with the wreckage of war. He saw the engineers, tiny figures against the vast broken bridge, and he understood. He had been mourning a ghost, a story. But the truth was a weapon. His love hadn't been a victim. She had been a soldier. A different kind of cold settled into him, not the cold of the German winter, but the cold, hard clarity of forged steel. The grief that had been a suffocating blanket was now a sharpened blade. He thought of the inscription he used to carve on his bullets. Sarah. He had written her name, a superstitious prayer for a safe return. But her name wasn't a shield. It was a call to arms. It was a mission she had started and he had to finish. Frankie returned, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. He took one look at Elias's face, at the letters spread around him like fallen leaves, and said nothing. He just leaned against the fender, offering the silent solidarity of a man who had seen too many souls find their breaking point or their purpose. "The light's different over here," Frankie said eventually, his voice low. "It's a colder light. Shows every crack." Elias carefully, reverently gathered the letters. He didn't put them back in his pocket as a relic. He placed them there as a manifesto. The map had been redrawn. The destination was no longer a quiet cabin by a lake. It was a truth waiting in the ruins of a Parisian clinic. He started the Jeep, the engine roaring to life, a sound that no longer felt like an echo of the war, but the beat of his own determined heart. He was no longer just driving toward Berlin. He was driving toward the conversation he should have had a year ago. He was driving to pick up the rifle he had dropped in the mud. The weight of this new truth settled on his shoulders. But for the first time since learning of her death, he felt his spine straighten with purpose. He had been mourning a passive, accidental death, a cruel twist of fate. But the truth, spelled out in her own rushed hand, was a heroic, chosen one. She had seen the line and crossed it without him. The lie he carried was not Sarah's, but his own. He was the one who had dropped the rifle in the mud. He was the one who had stopped fighting for the light, surrendering to the shadows of his grief. He had tried to hide in it, to make a home in the ruins of his own heart. He thought of the inscription he used to carve on his bullets. Sarah. He had etched her name into the soft lead tips, a superstitious prayer for a safe return, a charm to guide the metal away from his own flesh. But her name wasn't a shield. It never had been. It was a call to action. It was the mission she had started, the transmission she had begun, and he had been too lost in static to hear it. He drove toward Berlin, a city dissolving in fire and a strange final desperation. The war was a beast in its death throes. He saw the faces now, not of a faceless enemy, but of terrified German civilians huddled in basements, of exhausted, hollow-eyed boys in uniform who looked like the kids he'd gone to school with. He wasn't fighting an ideology anymore. He was navigating a tragedy. Every burned-out farmhouse, every shattered church spire was just another headstone in a continent-sized graveyard. He stopped his jeep on a hill overlooking a small town nestled in a valley. The order had come down. The town was a suspected strongpoint. It was to be shelled at 1600 hours. He had an hour. He killed the engine, and the silence that followed was immense, broken only by the distant, familiar thump of artillery, a sound that had become the heartbeat of this broken world. He pulled out the Eiffel Tower postcard. The colors were too bright, a lie of peace and permanence. He didn't burn it. He didn't tear it. He simply held it up, letting the cold, grey German air touch the picture of that impossible, frivolous beauty. He tried to imagine her there, not as a ghost, but as a living, breathing woman of conviction, her hands on a radio dial, her voice speaking in code. The postcard was no longer a totem of his loss, but a map of her courage. He put her letters back into his breast pocket. They were no longer a relic of a past he could never reclaim. They were a manifesto for a future he had to earn. Frankie found him there, leaning against the hood, his eyes on the doomed town below. The photographer didn't offer platitudes. He just lit 2 cigarettes and passed one to Elias. The smoke was sharp and real in the cold air. "They're just people down there, Frankie," Elias said, his voice rough. "Always were," Frankie replied, his camera hanging from his neck like a third eye. "The trick isn't seeing that. The trick is remembering it when the shells start falling." At 1550, the world changed. The first shell whistled overhead, a sound that started as a whisper and grew into a scream. It landed on the edge of the town, a blossom of orange and black and dirt. Then another, and another. The symphony of destruction began in earnest. Elias watched, his jaw tight. He saw a church spire, a tiny sliver of wood and faith from this distance, tremble and then collapse in on itself, swallowed by dust and flame. He thought of Sarah's words. I chose to fight with the truth. This wasn't truth. This was just the final brutal arithmetic of war. This was the sound the world made when it ran out of other options. He looked at the postcard again, then back at the burning town. Two different kinds of fire, one for creation, one for annihilation. He had been living in the ashes of the second. She had died fighting for the first. He had to stop running from her memory. He had to start running toward her purpose. He had to finish the line she had started, not with a rifle, but with the stubborn, unyielding act of remembrance. He had to become the living proof that her sacrifice meant something more than a name on a bullet or a word on a postcard. He started the Jeep. The engine turned over, a low growl against the cacophony of the barrage. He wasn't just driving toward the smoldering ruins of Berlin anymore. He was driving toward the conversation he should have had a year ago. He was driving to pick up the rifle he had dropped in the mud. Not to kill, but to finally lay it down for good. He walked on, the burden of this new truth settling upon his shoulders, heavier than any pack he had ever carried. Yet for the first time since the news of her death, his spine was straight. The city didn't breathe. It smoldered. Berlin was a corpse, and the smell of it, a thick, sweet rot of smoke, brick dust, and something unmistakably human, clung to the back of his throat, a taste he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. Elias moved through the ruins as a driver, a ghost ferrying other ghosts between shattered command posts. He saw the final chaotic collapse, but there was no glory in it. Only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, a relief that felt like a surrender. His unit was dug in near the Reichstag. The famous building was a pockmarked shell, its dome a skeletal ribcage against the grey sky. Everything was dust. Everything was a ghost. The victorious GIs in the newsreel photos looked tired, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. The desperate civilians moved like sleepwalkers through the rubble. But the pictures missed the sound. They missed the utter, crushing silence that fell between the distant crumps of artillery, a silence broken only by the whimpers of the lost and the shifting of stones. One evening, tasked with scouring a bombed-out apartment building for any useful intelligence, he found it not in a safe or a desk, but under a collapsed bookshelf. A small ceramic bird, a robin, its breast painted a cheerful, impossible red. It was unbroken. He crouched in the dust, the grit sharp under his knees, and held it in his palm. It was cool and smooth. A tiny, perfect symbol of a world that insisted on life, even here, in the heart of total annihilation. He thought of the cabin he'd promised Sarah. 2 stories, blue paint, a library. This robin would have sat on a windowsill there. He slipped it into his pocket, a new weight beside the worn postcard. He found Major Davenport by a map table set up in the relative shelter of a ruined tram car. The Major was a man who had aged 10 years in one, his face a roadmap of fatigue. Elias didn't salute. Formalities had died somewhere east of Bastogne. I need to go to Paris, sir, now. Davenport looked up from his maps, his eyes scanning Elias. He had seen the change in the quiet driver. He'd seen the moment the light had gone out after the letter arrived, and he'd seen the different, colder light that had replaced it after the bulge. A determined focus. A man running on a different kind of fuel. The war's done, Thorne, Davenport said, his voice raspy. Paperwork's all that's left. You're going home soon anyway. He paused, his gaze steady. What's in Paris? Elias's fingers found the ceramic bird in his pocket. He didn't pull it out. He just held it, feeling its solid, delicate truth. He looked past the Major, at a group of German prisoners shuffling past, their faces blank with a shock he recognized. They were just boys. They were all just boys. A debt, sir, Elias said, his voice low but clear. A conversation I should have had a year ago. Davenport held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. It was the understanding of one broken man to another. There were debts that outranked military discharge papers. There were battles that didn't end with a signature on a surrender document. He scribbled something on a piece of paper, a travel order, a permission slip to cross a continent and face a ghost. Don't get lost out there, son, the Major said not unkindly. Elias took the paper. He was already lost. That was the whole point. He'd been lost in the noise, in the grief, in the running. Paris wasn't about finding himself. It was about finding her, not the memory he'd constructed, the victim of a tragic accident, but the woman who had chosen her fate. The soldier. He walked away from the command post. the sounds of the ruined city fading into a hum. He knew he couldn't go home, couldn't face the quiet of a normal life, until he had stood in the place where her truth was louder than his own sorrow, until he heard the echo of the melody she was singing. The journey to Paris wasn't a detour. It was the final mission, the only one that truly mattered. Ele seguia pela estrada empoeirada, sentindo o peso da jornada em cada passo, mas guardando no peito propósito inabalável. Paris was still beautiful, but the beauty was a mask over the scars. It smelled of cheap wine and fresh paint over old blood. The people were celebrating, but their eyes held the same shadows he saw in the eyes of his fellow soldiers. He walked through the streets, a ghost among the living, the weight of the ceramic bird a small, hard truth in his pocket. He found the address on the note. A small, unassuming clinic near the Gare de l'Est. The windows were clean, the door freshly painted a dark green. Jean-Pierre was still there, older, tired, a subtle strain around his eyes that spoke of secrets kept and lives lost. He was sorting bandages, his movements efficient, worn. Elias walked in, not in uniform, but in a borrowed civilian coat. He looked like any other man coming home. Another soul trying to stitch a life back together from the tatters of peace. Jean-Pierre, Elias said, his voice flat, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. The doctor looked up, his eyes taking a moment to adjust, to see past the civilian clothes to the soldier beneath. "Can I help you?" "My name is Elias Thorne. I received your letter about Sarah." The doctor's face remained neutral, professional, a mask he had perfected under occupation. "Ah, Mr. Thorne." He put down the bandages, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. "I apologize again for your loss. It was a tragic accident, a skirmish near the tracks. The fighting, it was chaotic, even after the liberation." Elias didn't blink. He held the man's gaze, the static in his own head finally quiet, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. She wasn't an accident. She was working the radio. She was running for the resistance. Jean-Pierre closed his eyes. The lie was over. The air in the small clinic shifted, the professional veneer cracking to reveal the raw, exhausted man beneath. He gestured to a small wooden chair. Elias remained standing. "She made me promise," Jean-Pierre said, his voice dropping, the French accent softening the edges of his confession. "She said the mission was bigger than her memory. If the Germans knew she was a spy, if they even suspected after she was gone, they would have torn Paris apart looking for her cell. They would have taken me. They would have taken everyone. Her death had to be banal, a statistic of war, not a martyrdom. Why didn't you tell me?" Elias' voice was low, a rasp of gravel and pain. "I carried that lie for a year. I thought she was just in the wrong place." Jean-Pierre looked at him, his gaze heavy with the weight of the war, of all the quiet, terrible decisions made in shadows. "Because, mon ami, you were a soldier with a rifle. I had read her letters to you. I knew the man you were to her. I needed that man to keep fighting, to survive the Bulge, to cross the Rhine. If I had told you she was executed as a spy, what would you have done? You would have broken, or you would have sought a revenge that would have gotten you killed. Sarah needed you to survive, so I gave you a grief you could possibly live with." Elias had sought redemption in the face of death, but he found it in a painful, necessary lie. The truth was a physical blow, but clean, lacking the messy, random cruelty of the stray bullet. This death had purpose. Her life had a spine of steel he'd never fully seen. The grief that had been a suffocating blanket was now a sharpened blade. Jean-Pierre led him through a back door, into a small, hidden courtyard shielded from the street by a crumbling brick wall. It was a pocket of silence in the humming city. There, nestled among wild, struggling ivy, was a simple stone plaque. It was unadorned, rough-hewn. The inscription was brief, "Aux voix oubliées," to the forgotten voices. "Her name is not there," the doctor said softly, his hand resting on the cool stone. "It is safer that way. For history, but her name is on my heart, and that is enough." Elias finally wept. It wasn't the sudden, violent tears of a broken man in a foxhole. This was different. This was the slow, heavy, silent release of a man finally letting go of a year of suppressed, misdirected pain. He cried for the 2 stories, the blue paint and the library that would never be. He cried for the courage she had found in the heart of darkness, a courage he had momentarily lost. He cried for the weight of the rifle he had dropped, and for the heavier weight of the truth he now had to carry. He told Jean-Pierre about the cabin, the promise he'd made on the docks, the map that had kept him alive until the map itself had burned away. "We will build it, Elias," the doctor said, his voice firm, a hand on his shoulder. "Not the cabin, but the world that makes the cabin possible. That is what she died for, not for a flag or a country. For la vie, for life." Elias nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture of a tired boy. He looked at the postcard in his mind's eye, then at the doctor. The question he had carried across a continent finally finding its way to the air between them. Did she suffer? Jean-Pierre shook his head, a final truthful mercy. "No, Elias, she was singing. They took her from the radio. She was singing your melody." The music had survived, even when the musician did not. He stood in that quiet courtyard, the sounds of a liberated Paris, a distant murmur, and for the first time since the mud of Normandy, he felt a terrible, beautiful peace. The war was over. His had just changed its shape. Jean-Pierre led him through the narrow, damp corridor into the same hidden courtyard he had visited earlier. The rough-hewn stone plaque stood against the moss-eaten wall, dedicated to Les Voix Oubliées. Elias's eyes scanned the names once more, searching in vain for the familiar curves of her name. "Her name is on my heart, and that is enough," Jean-Pierre murmured, his voice barely a whisper in the still air. To put it in stone, it was too dangerous then. For the network, for her memory. A spy is not a martyr. She is a secret, even in death. Elias sank to his knees, the stone floor cool against his skin, and as the last of his defenses crumbled, the grief he had held at bay for so long finally broke over him in a silent, shuddering wave. He knelt as if the weight of the truth he now carried was a physical force, his forehead pressing against the cold, unyielding stone of the plaque. The names of the other forgotten souls were a stark contrast to the heat of his own grief, a silent communion for the two stories, the blue paint and the library that would never be. He felt the absence of the rifle he had dropped, and the profound presence of the courage she had found, a courage that had momentarily abandoned him in the mud of Belgium. In that silent transfer of warmth to the cold stone, he was finally letting go. When he could speak again, his voice was raw, scraped clean from the inside. He told Jean-Pierre about the cabin, the promise he'd made on the docks, the map that had kept him alive through the roar of Omaha Beach and the frozen hell of Bastogne, until the map itself had burned away in the light of a single word. Soon. "We will build it." "Elias," the doctor said, his voice firm, a hand settling on his shoulder with the weight of a shared burden. "Not the cabin, but the world that makes the cabin possible. That is what she died for. Not for a flag or a country. For la vie, for life." Elias nodded, a slow, weary motion. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the gesture of a tired boy, not a soldier who had seen a continent bleed. He looked at the doctor, the question he had carried across a continent, the one that had festered in the silence of his jeep and the cold of his foxhole, finally finding its way to the air between them. Did she suffer? The words were small, fragile things. Jean-Pierre shook his head, a final, truthful mercy. His eyes, old and tired, held Elias's gaze. "No, Elias, she was singing." They burst into the room. The radio was still crackling. "She was singing your melody, the one you said she always hummed. She did not beg. She did not cry out. She just sang." The music had survived, even when the musician did not, and this truth settled over him as a profound, terrible absolution. She had died defiant and whole, with their shared secret on her lips. A final act of resistance that transformed his understanding of her sacrifice. The truth of it settled over Elias not as a new wound, but as a profound, terrible absolution. He had pictured her terrified alone, a victim of random, meaningless violence. But she had been defiant. She had been whole. She had died with their shared secret on her lips, a final act of resistance. The silence that followed Jean-Pierre's words was not the silence of the grave or the silence of the rifle he had abandoned. It was the quiet of a church after a hymn has ended, the notes still hanging in the air, sacred and enduring. He stood in that quiet courtyard, the sounds of a liberated Paris, a distant cheer, the sputter of a jeep, a woman's laughter, a muted backdrop to the storm inside him finally calming. For the first time since the churning waters of the English Channel, he felt a terrible, beautiful peace. The war in Europe was over. His war, the one fought in the trenches of his own soul, had just changed its shape. Jean-Pierre led him back inside, to a small office cluttered with medical supplies and stacked papers. He poured 2 glasses of a harsh amber-colored brandy. They drank without toasting. The liquid burned a clean path down Elias's throat, a feeling more real than anything he'd felt in months. "What will you do now, mon ami?" Jean-Pierre asked, swirling the liquor in his glass. Elias looked at his own hands, calloused and scarred. They were a soldier's hands. They had held a rifle, dug graves, and clutched letters that smelled of gardenias. Now they felt empty, but not useless. "I have to learn how to be a person again," Elias said, the statement sounding both simple and impossibly complex. "Not a soldier. Not a ghost. A person." Jean-Pierre gave a slow, understanding nod. "It is the hardest fight. But you do not have to fight it alone. Stay here tonight. There is a cot in the back. The city, it is not for you yet. Not tonight." Elias didn't argue. The thought of facing the joyous, drunken crowds on the Champs-Élysées, of seeing couples kissing under the liberated streetlights, was a specific kind of torture he wasn't ready to endure. He accepted the offer with a grateful nod. That night, lying on the narrow cot in the storage room, surrounded by the scent of bandages and dust, Elias stared at the ceiling. He could hear the occasional shout from the street, the distant peal of a church bell. He took out the packet of letters, but he didn't read them. He simply held them. He didn't see the foxholes or the snow or the broken piano in Bastogne. He saw Sarah, not as a photograph, but as a living memory. He saw her leaning over a radio, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw her humming that simple tune, a small private smile on her lips as her fingers worked the dials. She wasn't a ghost haunting him. She was a compass. He had crossed an ocean and a war to find a truth he feared would destroy him. Instead, it had reassembled him. The man who had dropped his rifle in the mud was gone. The man who had run through the Ardennes, a hollow shell, was gone. What was left, here in this quiet room in Paris, was the foundation of someone new. Someone who had learned that the most powerful weapon wasn't a Garand, but the truth. That the most courageous act wasn't always charging a hill. But sometimes it was simply getting up the next morning and choosing to remember. He closed his eyes. The war was over, and for the first time he believed his life was just beginning. He returned to the United States in the summer of 1946, but the man who stepped off the troopship was not Private Thorne. He was just Elias, a quiet, thin man whose eyes, which had seen too much, now winced against the gentle American sunlight. It felt like an accusation. He carried the letters and the postcard in the breast pocket of his civilian jacket, a weight more permanent than any rifle. They were his new dog tags, the only identification that mattered. He didn't go home. He couldn't. The thought of his old town with its well-meaning neighbors and their easy questions, "We heard about Sarah, such a tragedy," was a cage. Their pity would be a kind of burial, and he wasn't ready to let her be buried twice. So he took a train north, following the coast until the towns grew sparse and the air tasted of salt and pine. He bought a small, rugged plot of land in New England, where the cliffs met the sea. It was a raw, honest place, scoured by the wind. He didn't build the 2-story house with blue paint from the promise on the docks. That dream belonged to 2 other people, ghosts from a world before the map faded. Instead, he built a 1-room cabin. He felled the trees himself, the ache in his muscles a welcome replacement for the ache in his soul. He left the wood unpainted, letting it gray and weather with the seasons. It was simple. It was honest. It was exactly what she would have built. But he built the library. It was a separate, small room with a large window that faced the ocean. He filled it with shelves made from driftwood and old ammunition crates. He bought every book he could afford, scouring second-hand shops for poetry, for history, for the works of French philosophers whose names Jean-Pierre had whispered. This room became his sanctuary. It was here, surrounded by the resilience of the human spirit etched on thousands of pages, that the horrors of the war could be held at bay. The sound of mortars was replaced by the soft rustle of a turning page. The stench of mud and death was cleansed by the smell of old paper and sea air. He wrote a book, not about the battles of Normandy or the frozen hell of the Bulge, not about the fear or the blood. He wrote about the simple things, the smell of gardenias on a hot summer dock, the sound of an honest laugh across a crowded room, the way a single, ordinary woman could look at a broken world and choose to mend it with a whisper into a radio. He wrote about the quiet courage that outlasts the storm. He published it anonymously. He called it the quiet before the storm. The quiet was no longer the worst part. It was the space where she still spoke. He lived a life of deliberate quiet. He never married. He never spoke of the war at the general store or to the few fishermen he knew. The words were all in the book, a silent confession for anyone who cared to listen. He learned the rhythm of the tides, the patterns of the gulls, the way the light changed over the water in the afternoon. It was a different kind of survival. Every year on the anniversary of the liberation of Paris, he would perform the same ritual. He would grind the coffee beans by hand, the way she used to like it. He would sit in his library chair, the one that faced the window, and he would take out her final letter. He wouldn't read the words about the radio or the resistance. He would simply hold the paper, feeling the texture of her urgency, and then he would look out at the sea. The sound of the ocean was a constant rhythmic crash. It was the only thing loud enough, powerful enough, to eventually drown out the sound of mortars that never truly leave you. Over the decades, the war's noise became a faint echo, a distant thunder beneath the relentless, cleansing rhythm of the waves. He would sometimes see young couples walking along the beach below his cliff, their hands clasped, their faces bright with a future they believed was guaranteed. They made the same oversized promises he and Sarah had made, their love a brilliant, fragile thing against the vastness of the water. He never stopped them. He never offered warnings. He just watched, a small, knowing upturn on his lips, a silent blessing from a man who understood the cost of such promises. He realized the final, quiet irony of his life. The man who had dropped his rifle in the Belgian mud had not stopped fighting. He had simply changed his weapon. His weapon was memory. His war, his lifelong solitary campaign, was against forgetting. He finally understood that the greatest act of love was not protection, but remembrance. It was to bear witness, to keep the melody alive, even when the musician was gone. And so, in the quiet of his cabin by the sea, Elias Thorne stood his post. He was the keeper of the flame, the guardian of a whisper, a soldier still, in the only war that ever truly mattered. He lived a quiet life, the kind that only settles in after a great storm has passed. While he never spoke of the war at the general store or to the few fishermen he knew, he had given it voice in the pages of his anonymous book, a confession scattered to the winds for strangers to find. Every year on the anniversary of the liberation of Paris, a ritual as sacred as any communion, he would grind the beans, the sound of sharp domestic percussion against the morning's hush. He would make the coffee the way she used to like it, strong, with a single spoon of sugar that dissolved like a forgotten secret. He would carry the steaming mug into his library, the room that was his true monument, and he would sit in the worn leather chair that faced the window. He wouldn't open the book. He would open the small unpainted box. His fingers, now gnarled with time, would find the final letter. He wouldn't read the words about the radio or the resistance, the coded language of her courage. He didn't need to. He would simply hold the paper, feeling the texture of her urgency, the faint impression of her pen on the page. It was a topography of love and fear, a map he had long since memorized. Then he would lift his gaze and look out at the sea. The sound of the ocean was a constant rhythmic crash, a relentless breathing presence. It was the only thing loud enough, powerful enough, to eventually drown out the sound of mortars that never truly leave you. They were always there, a phantom orchestra tuning in the back of his skull. But over the decades, the war's noise became a faint echo, a distant thunder beneath the cleansing, endless rhythm of the waves. The sea didn't judge. It just was. It took the memories, the sharp edges of the shrapnel lodged in his mind, and smoothed them into sea glass. He would sometimes see them, young couples walking along the wet, hard-packed sand of the beach below his cliff. Their hands were clasped, their faces turned toward each other, bright with a future they believed was guaranteed, as solid as the ground beneath their feet. They made the same oversized promises he and Sarah had made on a dock that felt a world away. Their love, a brilliant, fragile thing against the vast, indifferent grey of the water and sky. He never stopped them. He never leaned out the window to offer warnings about the chaos and the cold steel. He just watched, a small, knowing upturn on his lips, a silent blessing from a man who understood the profound, necessary cost of such promises. Their hope was the victory. Their ignorant, beautiful faith was the very thing he had helped buy with his youth. He realized the final, quiet irony of his life, sitting there in that chair. The man who had dropped his rifle in the Belgian mud, who had let the cold steel fall from his hands in a moment of absolute surrender, had not stopped fighting. He had simply changed his weapon. His weapon was memory. His war, his lifelong solitary campaign fought in the quiet of a New England morning, was against forgetting. It was a war of attrition against the silence. Every time he held that letter, every time he remembered the scent of gardenias on a New York dock, he was firing a shot. Every time he watched a young couple and felt a pang not of jealousy, but of fierce, protective hope, he was winning a battle. He finally understood that the greatest act of love was not protection. You couldn't protect anyone, not really. Not from a stray bullet in Paris, not from the shrapnel in a frozen forest. The greatest act of love was remembrance. It was to bear witness, to be the keeper of the flame long after the fire had gone out, to keep the melody alive even when the musician was gone. And so, in the quiet of his cabin by the sea, Elias Thorne stood his post. Year after year, wave after wave, he was the keeper of the flame, the guardian of a whisper, a soldier still, in the only war that ever truly mattered. The coffee would grow cold in the cup. The sun would climb higher, bleaching the color from the sky. He would sit there until the tide began to turn, until the rhythm of the water outside matched the slow, steady beat of his own heart. A heart that had been broken, yes, shattered into 1,000 pieces somewhere in the mud of Europe, but had been painstakingly put back together, piece by piece, with the glue of memory and the stubborn, unyielding conviction that her sacrifice had meant something, that love in the end was not a feeling but a duty, and he was its most faithful servant. Elias Thorne died in the cabin, in his sleep, on a quiet Tuesday morning in late autumn. The light was soft that day, the kind of pale, forgiving gold that only comes after a season of storms. He was an old man, his body a map of faded scars and quiet aches, and his passing was as simple and honest as the house he had built with his own 2 hands. There was no struggle, just a final, slow exhalation that merged with the sound of the distant tide. The local doctor, a young man who only knew Mr. Thorne as the quiet writer with the library full of French poetry, found him. The old man was lying on his side, facing the large window that looked out over the churning Atlantic. On the bedside table, a cup of cold coffee sat beside a well-worn, anonymous book. He was peaceful. Beside his hand rested a small, worn, unpainted wooden box. The doctor, with a reverence he didn't quite understand, opened the box. Inside, laid out with a soldier's precision, were 3 items. 1. A crumpled photograph, its edges softened by 50 years of careful handling. A girl squinted into a summer sun, her smile a defiant slash of light against the fading paper. It still smelled faintly, impossibly, of gardenias. 2. A brightly colored postcard of the Eiffel Tower. On the back, a single word in elegant feminine handwriting. Soon. The paper was brittle, a hairline crack running through the S like a scar. 3. A small ceramic robin, its paint faded but its form unbroken. A tiny, perfect testament to survival plucked from the ashes of Berlin. There was no note, no last word scrawled on a pad. He had said everything that needed saying over a lifetime of silent mornings. But on the frontispiece of the book, The Quiet Before the Storm, which lay open on his bedside table, he had added one final, elegant sentence in his old, familiar script. The ink was fresh, a dark blue against the yellowed page. It was the final chapter of his journal, the one he had never dared to finish until the very end. It wasn't about the war, it was about her. And even after the war ended and the noise stopped, he never stopped listening for the melody she was singing. The doctor closed the book. He looked from the old man's serene face to the 3 relics in the box. He was a man of science, of facts. But in that quiet room, he felt the immense weight of a story he would never know. He saw the photo of the girl, the postcard from a city that had taken her, and the little bird that had outlasted an empire. He didn't see a collection of objects. He saw a lifetime of devotion, a battle fought not with rifles but with memory. They buried him on the property, in a simple plot under a young oak tree that faced the sea. It was what he had wanted. No flag, no 21-gun salute, just the wind and the gulls and the relentless, consoling rhythm of the waves. A few people from the nearby town came, people who had bought his anonymously published book without knowing the man behind the words, who had only known him as a kind, distant neighbor who always had time to listen. After the others had left, the doctor remained. He stood there, the unpainted box in his hands. He opened it one last time. He saw the postcard, the word soon. He thought of all the young men and women in his own life, all the promises made that were bigger than the world would allow. He thought of the quiet tragedies that never make the history books, the loves that become ghosts, the melodies that only one person can still hear. He closed the box. The sound of the latch was soft, final. It was the sound of a story being passed on, not through words but through the heavy, beautiful silence it left behind. And even after the war ended, the boy who left never truly returned. In his place came a man forged by loss, his sharp edges of grief softened by time into a quiet, steady acceptance. The boy he had been remained there, in the trenches in Bastogne, in the ruined church with the destroyed piano, in the small office in Paris where a doctor told a necessary lie. He had left that boy with a young woman who smelled of gardenias and courage, and the life he built by the sea was not a monument to her absence, but a testament to the peace he had finally won. If you've ever loved someone who changed the world with a whisper, if you've ever held a memory so tightly it became a part of your breath, if you've ever stood your post, long after the battle was over, guarding a light that only you can see, then this story belongs to you. It was never just his story. It was yours. It is the story of anyone who has ever chosen to remember when it would be easier to forget.